some that are in places where we have property. And remember, there's just as much possibility that we would forego the less expensive line where we own property and basically could start this process at the end of the environmental process much more quickly. We own a majority of the property on those series of lines that or that one particular path that runs from Castle Rock down into Vancouver.
Which path do you own the majority
that
of the
would
property? The
be
most westerly
right over
one?
here, the one labeled 9 down through 25. But that's why you put that on the map. You own it. It's a place where you could build.
It's just an obvious choice.
Absolutely. And then you've got to go out and find the other points, the other paths between Castle Rock, Washington and Troutdale, Oregon, which Mark's team did early in the process, and say, okay, if we weren't just going to use this, where else could we go? And that's why you put that range of options together. And that's why you tell people early, we're considering this project. We want you involved. It could potentially affect you. You're in a place where we're considering building this. And all of these lines that exist on this map today that run between these 2 points in Castle Rock and Troutdale, with the exception of these where we actually have an existing line or existing easement, started as mile-wide study corridors where Mark had engineers and other folks on the ground looking at the environmental circumstances there. Well, they've now been dissolved down or lessened down into 150-foot wide corridors where there actually would be an easement. They've got actual preliminary designs for these paths where the towers would be. And that's why the process continues to go. We want people's reaction to those tower placements on their property, to where the line would be in relation to where they live and those other environmental circumstances that exist near where they live.
You mentioned 150 feet easement as being the standard for this. The question is, when it comes to that distance, 150 feet, versus in some states and some areas they've got regulations that say 350 feet or 350 feet from the edge of the line. Those are, I guess, state. It's not a federal standard.
I think what you're referencing, I think the state of California has an ordinance passed that says you can't construct a school within 350 feet of a transmission line. And there's a lot of misinterpretations of what that particular state ordinance says, but it says that the Department of Education in the state of California says you won't build a school within 350 feet of an existing high voltage line.
And that does not apply to Washington State because that's a California state law.
Absolutely.
Do you guys pay attention to that here, even though it's not a state law? Do you try to comply with that?
No,
I mean,
we note the purpose for that. And so one of the things we're considering as we look at different routes for the new transmission line is that we want to avoid being near school buildings where children are, because people want us to. So that's one of the considerations we made in some electing routes we have.
So is that a consideration at this point, or is there a pretty firm commitment so far that I know nothing's really set in concrete yet, but is that one of your guiding principles as you're discovering them as you go, or one of your rules that you're trying to follow to stay clear, 350 feet clear of a church or a school or some large public gathering place?
There really isn't a number associated with it because there isn't any regulation and there isn't any agreed upon number that everybody would feel comfortable with. So what we try to do is stay as far away as we can. And where we do come close to schools, and again, each individual needs to define what is close. You know, what does close mean to them? Does it mean 100 feet? Does it mean 1,000 feet? Does it mean a mile?
Well, just to separate it out between 150 feet and 350 feet, you're going to have more people that are going to have problems with 150 feet, and they'll think, I'll take 350. I'm not asking for 1,000. Right. In other words, just to keep it so that it's manageable. The question is, are there really no numbers at this point?
Well, but that's one of the things that will be in the draft environmental impact statement and in our decision process is how close to each of these lines come to schools, as with how close do we come to houses. Mm-hmm. So there is no path that stays 3 miles from anything. You know,
sure.
There's just a lot of development in Clark and Cowlitz County as we're trying to get from A to B. So again, we try to consider the dozens of things that people are concerned about, and people are not only concerned about schools and houses, they're concerned about property values, they're concerned about the tax code on their small timber farm, and whether our cutting an easement across it kicks them into a different tax bracket. They're concerned about funding for their schools and DNR ability to harvest timber. They're concerned about recreation and riparian habitat. So those are all things that we're going to consider.
You consider all those.
We understand, that homes and schools are high profile. That's very important to us, and that's why we're going to look at how close we get to each of those on all of these segments as we consider one versus the other.
Okay. Camas being one of those small communities that has passed an ordinance that basically said you have to stay within, you can't get closer, to 350 feet to a new overhead transmission line. Is that right?
There's an ordinance that says any new transmission has to be underground.
Underground. But I'm not familiar with distance ordinances. I think, and we're familiar with the ordinance that says any new transmission would have to be put underground, not overhead. But we're not familiar with any distance.
Well, I guess we'll have to we'll look it up and we'll cite that. The question is, even if you had a small town like that passed an ordinance that said, hey, you can't do it, if they said, hey, BPA, you can't put a transmission line within 350 feet of anything, still, that's not binding on the BPA. You're a federal
that's correct.
agency.
That's
right?
correct. And by law, we operate that way. But if they're concerned, whatever they're concerned about that causes them to pass that regulation, we're concerned about the same thing. So that's what we're going to study, and we're going to try to minimize in any proposed routes we have. So Camas is one of the areas where there are places, where we're trying to minimize impact to people. People don't want their home taken. So we have existing easement through there. If we reconfigure the lines that are there, we can make room for the new line. And the way we position that, we can minimize the increase in magnetic field strength. In fact, in some cases, there's no increase in magnetic field strength off right-of-way because of the way we configure it. So that's good news. That doesn't mean people say, okay, come on in and build it, because it's still a visual impact and other impacts. But that's just an example of, Camas is concerned about magnetic field strengths and other things, so we are, and we're going to do what we reasonably can to minimize those impacts.
So on one side we have what I consider a soft kind of a decision, which is just simply trying to balance out all the different needs or requests of people, trying to minimize the number of unhappy people, maximize the number of happy people. And on the other end, you have non-negotiables. And that is, one of those non-negotiables is a state law. So if there is a state law that said you have to be 350 feet or some distance away from schools and churches and houses or existing homes, those kind of things, then that would be binding on the BPA.
It would not.
No.
The state can't regulate the federal government.
So it would have to be. So the federal government is bigger than the state. So even the state can't say you can't do this, you can't do that. So only the federal government can do that.
Yeah, the state can't regulate a federal agency. But again, if the state is concerned about an issue and has passed legislation to deal with it, we're concerned about that same issue, even though we're not bound by the regulation.
And let me just I don't want to belabor the point,
sure.
But I assume that even though the state isn't necessarily a binding agency, that BPA you can still say, hey, we're going to do it anyway. I would expect it to be very highly unlikely if there was a state law that that BPA would still violate that in the eyes of the state. I wouldn't think you would naturally do that.
Well, we would try to meet the intent of the law or regulation if it's a reasonable choice for BPA to make. So if they say stay away from schools and we can do it, we're going to do it. But when you stay away from a school or some other issue, you create impacts somewhere else. So you need to consider those too. If you solve one problem by not locating on parcel A, that's great, but that means you're locating it on parcel B. So who owns parcel B and what are they concerned about? So we need to consider, everybody's issues.
Absolutely. That's right. If you have a line, let's say that you've got a straight line on a map from here to here, and there's a few areas that are off to the side of this, can the line be jogged a little bit this way in that area, a little bit that way in that area, or how important is that these lines be straight, or you need a
Well,
different kind of construction of a tower in order to have those side
Let's look at the
loads?
map here. The lines
Okay.
aren't straight. And that's because we're trying to avoid things. We're trying to avoid things like homes and schools and lakes and mountains and highways.
Well, you've got a few basic corners there, but the question is on a smaller, more micro scale, can you jog the line a little bit this way, maybe move it a couple hundred feet this way, 200 feet that way? Are those small fine tunes well within the scope, or does that add significant cost?
That's well within the scope, and this map reflects a lot of that, because again, we've gone through preliminary design and we have specific tower locations for every segment on that map. So we've already dealt with that at a pretty close level. When we get to the point where we identify a preferred alternative, then we're going to concentrate our resources on dealing with those people who own that land and live immediately adjacent. So we're going to certainly take the opportunity to refine that design, move towers, whatever it takes to balance the impacts, minimize impacts to people. So absolutely, we're constantly under review of our designs and making changes.
Okay, where you have an existing easement and maybe you have some existing towers and lines in that easement and you want to be able to add this this new line through there, would you leave those existing lines alone normally, and just simply add the additional lines somewhere within that easement, or would you actually do some tear down and replacement in that area?
Well, the answer is yes to all of those. Segments 9 and 25, which is our westernmost route, is mostly an existing easement that is 2 lines wide, and we've only used half of it to date. So that means we would leave the existing 230 kV line that's there alone and build a new 500 kV adjacent to it, mostly on existing easement, and not have to purchase anything from anybody. There are lots of variations on how to get through an area, such as down between Vancouver and Camas, where we, like I said, in Camas, we have existing lines and easement. There isn't room for a new 500, but we can reconfigure things there and make room. Sometimes that means double circuiting lines that are already there, putting 2 circuits on one line, having a single circuit new 500. Sometimes it means putting the new 500 on an existing circuit. There's just about every option is represented in all of these segments here. So whatever works best for a certain area, that's what we're proposing.
And anybody interested in actually seeing how that would play out near them, who's located near or on one of these segments, can get that information from our website. It's www.bpa.gov/go/I5, and I believe those are forward slashes. We've actually got a spreadsheet that shows segment by segment whether it would be new right away with a single line in it. If we have an existing line there, it tells whether or not we would place one adjacent or combine the lines on the same tower or a different tower. So they can actually find that out on the website. I'm
curious if people's if many people, I know there's a great multitude and there's many different issues on this, but for those cases where people are most fearful of the EMF, the magnetic fields, has the BPA ever constructed it's a compensation kind of a line where you run adjacent, maybe closer to the edge of the easement, with a current carrier that will basically cancel the field that would normally be emitted from outside that easement? I know they've done that kind of thing to compensate for schools, where in California, for instance, where they've got real close, they run this line around and they've got the magnetic field that cancels. Has the BPA ever considered a magnetically canceling line? And you wouldn't necessarily have to call it a loss. You could reverse, just reverse the current in that line. Doesn't have to be a high voltage line; just needs to carry the same current in order to cancel it, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard that a proposal like that before. We've dealt with reconfiguring what's there with what we want to add, but it's never been brought to my attention before, the proposal of building a second line just for the purpose of trying to mitigate magnetic field strength.